Hey guys, Mrs. McManus here, and welcome to my screencast on the English Civil War. A few notes. I have adapted this PowerPoint originally given by a teacher named Susan Poder who taught AP Euro in New York. I have added on to the PowerPoint to include some more details, but I'd still like to give credit to her considering the PowerPoint is mostly hers. Secondly, I am giving notes based on A History of Modern Europe 3rd edition by John Merriman. All the lecture that I am giving was adapted from his research. So, we start with Queen Elizabeth. And to put this into context, this is the daughter of my best friend Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and Queen Elizabeth of Shakespeare. So, Queen Elizabeth died in 1603. She had no children, so her cousin, who was King James VI of Scotland, came to the throne in England, where he was known as King James I. In becoming king of both countries, the countries technically became joined. He was supposedly pretty lazy and frivolous, but also very shrewd as well. His relationship with Parliament was very shaky, and he believed that he received the monarchy through divine right. When he became king, England was hurting financially, partially due to Elizabeth's war debts. In order to raise funds, he sold titles and offices, which didn't please Parliament. So Parliament during this time only met when called by the king, so it was very sporadic. However, it had grown into a very serious institution that saw itself as protecting the English people's rights. Parliament had fought previously with Elizabeth over who had the right to make foreign policy decisions, and they kept up that fight with James. James was an outsider who wanted absolute power and didn't really understand English rules or customs. Suffice it to say that James never had a good relationship with Parliament. And this may be my favorite story of the entire English Civil War. So early on in James's rule in 1605, a plot was discovered. A group of Catholics planned to blow up King James and the Parliament on November 5th. This group of Catholics had been persecuted by the Protestant government for years before, and they wanted to replace the leadership with Catholics. At about midnight on November 4th, a man by the name of Guy Fawkes was found in the basement of Parliament with many barrels of gunpowder. He and the other men involved were planning on blowing up the Houses of Parliament. They were tried and sentenced to be executed for treason. Guy Fawkes tried to escape just before his hanging, but in his escape he fell from the gallows and broke his neck and died. After this, new laws were put into place to disallow Catholics from having the right to vote, along with other laws to restrict them. Just on a side note, Great Britain actually still celebrates Guy Fawkes Day to this day. They light bonfires, they burn effigies of Guy Fawkes, and they set off fireworks in celebration. Anyway, back to James. He faced many religious divisions within his own country. Plots against him by the Catholics were serious, but many of the decisions that he made throughout the rest of his reign were deemed suspiciously pro-Catholic by his opposition in Parliament. One such fight was his getting involved in the 30 Years' War. Another such was James's attempt to marry his son Charles to the daughter of the Spanish king. Parliament didn't like this due to it seeming that the country's foreign policy would be pro-Catholic, and of course they had just fought against Spain under Elizabeth, and they thought that this would tie the two countries together. Parliament said that they technically had the right to discuss this since it was foreign policy to marry a monarch from England to a monarch from Spain, but James refused. In 1623, the wedding plans fell through anyway, so King James decided to marry his son off to the daughter of King Henry IV and Maria de Medici. So this would be Henry of Navarre, who was the monarch at the end of the French Civil War, when he was the guy who converted and reconverted from Catholicism to Calvinism many times. Their daughter's name was Henrietta Maria. A secret deal had been made where King James of England had promised that English Catholics could practice religion freely, which, of course, this all-Protestant Parliament and country would not take favor to. James died in 1625, so Charles took the throne as King Charles I. During Charles's reign, religious dissension came from a group of people called the Puritans, who were from a branch of Calvinism. They were hostile to the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, because they thought that they were too much like the Catholic Church. They didn't believe in the role of bishops, and they thought that power should instead be given to synods, which were councils made up of clerical and lay leaders. They emphasized personal understanding of the Bible and believed in predestination as well. While they made up only about 10% of the population, they made up perhaps one-third of the gentry, which was a growing population. King Charles's financial edicts and policies started to upset many landowners within England because he was asking for unreasonable demands, and, of course, without permission of Parliament. He ended up calling 3 parliaments in 4 years, but sent them away when they refused to provide him more money. In 1628, Charles was forced to accept the Petition of Right. Previously to this, the king had created loans without Parliament's permission and demanded that they be paid back in 3 months. Then he jailed those who refused to pay. So this new Petition of Rights didn't allow him to continue this practice. It also disallowed him from arbitrarily arresting citizens. This document, while seeming insignificant, was really important to the story of how England eventually became a constitutional monarchy, with Parliament being the one to decide taxes and disallowing arbitrary arrests. Charles was angered by this, however, and decided to dissolve Parliament in 1629. So he ruled without calling Parliament again for another 11 years. He tried creative ways to gain money, but England started down the road to economic crisis, with inflation increasing and debt increasing. In Scotland, rebellions began as he started to take noble lands and even ordered that the Presbyterian Church, which was the Scottish national church, must use the Anglican Book of Common Prayer. When the Scottish rebelled, Charles prepared for invasion. But of course, he needed to fund this war. So in 1639, he demanded that the city of London pay for it. London decided to give him a loan, but on the condition that Parliament had to be reconvened. So in April of 1640, they were convened, but when they refused to pay for Charles's war, he dissolved them after less than 2 months. This Parliament is known as the Short Parliament. So a quick thing about English history. The Magna Carta was created in 1215, and it was created to protect the rights of Englishmen against a monarch who was too powerful. Parliament was seen by many as the protectorate of those rights. So the question became, how should England be governed? It's also important to note that Charles's court was filled with people who were influenced by Catholicism, and his wife also brought to court artists who were influenced by the themes of the Catholic Reformation. Many were fearful then that Catholicism would take hold in England once again. In the time leading up to the war, titled nobles tended to support Charles, but gentry started opposing the king. Remember, a number of these gentry, approximately a third of them, were Puritans. So some historians call what's to come the Puritan Revolution, but it's important to note that it isn't just Puritans who resisted the monarchy. So in 1640, Charles called Parliament again. But he had strengthened his army to fight the Scots with an army of Catholic Irish regiments, whose leader was named the Earl of Strafford, and who became a supporter and advisor to the king. Many were convinced that there was a popish plot afoot. So Parliament tried and executed the Earl of Strafford in London. They then said that only Parliament had the right to dissolve itself, and that all of the unpopular acts of the king since Parliament had last been convened were now abolished. In November of 1641, they passed a document that called for religious and administrative reforms called the Grand Remonstrance. This passed narrowly through Parliament, and soon thereafter, some locals began to take up arms to support the king. The king attempted a coup of Parliament in January of 1642. He personally led a few hundred armed soldiers into Parliament and commanded that the Puritan leader, Pym, be arrested. Pym had been warned, though, before and left before the king could arrive to capture him. Charles ended up fleeing to the country, since most of London seemed to be supporting Parliament, and he started to mobilize his army in the summer of 1642. So now we have the beginning of the English Civil War. There were 2 sides to this war. Parliament soldiers were known as Roundheads because they wore their hair in bowl-shaped haircuts, and the king's men were called Cavaliers. I suggest that you pause the video here to look at the characteristics of each side of the war. The war was actually not too long or bloody, especially compared to the 30 Years' War, and it really only had 4 major battles, as you can see here according to this map. The war was fought not only against armies, but it was a war to convince people. Both sides, the Cavaliers and the Roundheads, had huge propaganda campaigns against the other, and according to John Merriman, quote, more than 22,000 newspapers, newsletters, pamphlets, broadsides, sermons, and speeches were published between 1640 and 1661. In 1643, Parliament decided to form an alliance with Scotland, and they fought a major battle in Marston Moor near York. This was one of the 4 major battles. Oliver Cromwell had led the Roundheads, or the Puritans, during the battle in what became to be known as the New Model Army, and eventually he became a leader of Parliament. Within Parliament, the Puritans were splitting politically between those who were militant, called the Independents, and those who wanted to negotiate a peace with the king, called Presbyterians. Now, to confuse you even more, these Presbyterians were actually Puritans, but they had developed as a pro-Scottish group, hence the name. Cromwell himself was technically considered an independent, the more militant of the 2 groups. King Charles surrendered to the Scots in 1646 and was given to Parliament to be taken into custody in 1647. At this point, radicals were taking over the New Model Army, and England was dividing up even more along religious radical groups. There were those who felt that only adults should be baptized, or the Baptists. There were those who opposed the private ownership of land, and there were those who rejected heaven or hell and said that true salvation could be found in alcohol and sexual intercourse. Clearly, England was facing a religious crisis more than just Puritans versus Anglicans. Parliament became fearful of the New Model Army and tried to disband it, but the army refused. They set up a council and a few regiments actually mutinied, but Oliver Cromwell crushed them into submission. Meanwhile, King Charles II had escaped in November 1647 and fled. It's King Charles I. The independents within Parliament actually did away with the House of Lords and removed all Presbyterians from Parliament. This new Parliament was called the Rump Parliament. Yes, that's right, the Rump Parliament. They tried to negotiate with the king, but the king had been secretly plotting with the Scottish to invade England. So, the Rump Parliament appointed a special court to try the king for treason. He refused to defend himself, was found guilty, and executed on January 30th, 1649. He was beheaded. Thereafter, the monarchy was abolished, as well as the House of Lords. England became a republic called the Commonwealth of England. Cromwell became the leader, and the rules originally with the Rump Parliament, though he doesn't do so well with this Parliament. So here's the shocker now. Since things weren't going well with the Rump Parliament, and they hadn't dissolved themselves in a few years, Cromwell ordered it dissolved in 1653. Cromwell then decides to handpick 140 men to serve in this new parliament that he's going to establish, and England essentially becomes a military dictatorship ruling under martial law. In the next few years, he crushes rebellions in both Ireland and Scotland, and fought wars with the Dutch Republic and Spain. Cromwell, now called the Lord Protector, made many of the same mistakes as the previous monarch. He levied taxes without Parliament's approval and got rid of people who disagreed with him. He granted religious freedom to all Puritan sects, but not to Catholics or Anglicans. He was essentially a monarch in all but name, and the Parliament even offered him the title at one point, though he refused. But alas, he died in 1658, leaving his less able son Richard in charge. Now to this sort of sad and abrupt ending to this story, I suppose, or perhaps not so sad. In the end, under the leadership of a former royalist who led the Scottish army, Charles's son, Charles II, was invited back to England to become king. So in 1660, with the help of the general, they marched into England and assumed control. The lesson learned from this whole ordeal is that Parliament could no more exist without the Crown than the Crown without Parliament. So the English Civil War was over, but stay tuned for more turmoil in England in what comes to be known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688.